All right, good evening everybody. It's good that you're doing AppSync at the GraphQL day because you'll be able to correct all the misconceptions I leave with you today. So I'm going to talk to you about two AWS technologies tonight. We're going to talk about AppSync, but also AWS Amplify. Really, I want to talk about GraphQL in AWS in the context of full stack app development. So I'm Peter. I've been doing software for a while. I recently kind of refocused around building full stack applications. And one of the reasons for that is I'm really intrigued and excited by backend-as-a-service or serverless architectures. I think they offer a lot of promise to improve some of the practices we have in building software today. So for me, one of the big improvements with these architectures is it helps me get to software faster with my end users, interactive software. I find too many software groups are focused on their big releases, the 1.0s, the 2.0s. I'm much more interested in working towards a 0.1, a 1.1, getting something interactive that I can share with the user, start that dialogue, get feedback, and work towards the right 1.0 and 2.0. So these architectures offer a lot to help with that. I'm also not precious about code. I would rather use code that someone else has already written, whether that's libraries or services, if I can. If I don't have to write something, that's great. So I'm more than happy to take advantage of services offered by others. There's kind of two reasons for that, but one of them is that humans are expensive. We're almost always the most expensive part of a development project. So to the extent that I can cut out some cost, I'm actually decreasing the what that app would have to cost. And I should say that at scale, some of these things don't apply, but I have worked with a lot of fairly large companies, and almost always they say, we wish we could act more like a startup. And I think these technologies have some promise in that regard as well. So some of you, when I say serverless or backend-as-a-service, that doesn't mean anything to you. I actually like the term backend-as-a-service better than serverless, but I'm going to use them interchangeably. Backend-as-a-service, I think, communicates what I think of more accurately. I'm really talking about replacing anything that I would have coded, written to a server, and deployed as a server, replacing that with a service that's provided by a cloud vendor. But I'm going to use the term serverless instead of backend-as-a-service just because it's less syllables. And there are all kinds of services available today from all kinds of cloud vendors. So things like authentication, databases, file storage functions, hosting, APIs. That's really where AppSync fits into the equation here. There's AI and ML services. There's pub/sub services. They're on and on and on. Okay, so the first technology we're going to talk about is, or maybe the second technology we're going to talk about is AWS AppSync. I'm kind of curious, how many people here by hand were familiar or are familiar with AWS AppSync? Okay, and keep your hand up if you've tried it. And keep your hand up if you've done something in a production-like environment or something that will go to production. Okay, so I think the percentages were maybe like 30%, 15%, and one guy on the last one. So AppSync is AWS's GraphQL service. It's GraphQL as a service. The bit in bold here comes from the AWS marketing literature, and it's a decent description of what the service is. And we're going to talk more about it, of course. But really, the first technology I want to talk about is AWS Amplify, or the AWS Amplify Framework. And again, I'm curious, same question as on the previous slide. How many folks are aware of AWS Amplify? Okay, so it's about the same. How many have tried it? Okay, very small number. And how many have used it in a production-related environment? Okay, so two people. So some of you may have heard of, if you haven't heard of Amplify, you may have heard of AWS Mobile Hub. Amplify is kind of the evolution of that. I would suggest to you it's Amazon's competitor to Google Firebase. I don't know that Amazon thinks of it that way or that they describe it that way. Those are my words. But really what Amplify is meant to be is the glue between your application or your front end and the back-end AWS services that you're using to provide your server. So, AWS wants you to use their services. They want to make that as easy as possible. Amplify is their attempt to really make it easy to adopt their back-end technologies in your front-end application. Amplify is organized into categories, so these categories kind of map to the services that AWS offers on the back end. I'm not going to read these to you, but we're going to be focused here in the API category. That's where AppSync fits in. Amplify does support standing up both GraphQL and REST APIs, and of course AppSync is GraphQL. Okay, so the process of using Amplify is pretty straightforward. You need to have an AWS account. You need to install the Amplify CLI. It's a very simple install. It's a global NPM install. It has a small config that asks you maybe 10 questions or so, where they walk through the process of creating a new user on your AWS account, but not an interactive user. This is the user in which, when you call the CLI, the commands you execute will be in the context of that user. So basically you're creating a user that can do stuff in your AWS account. And then the third part of Amplify is documents and libraries, right? So they want you to use their technology when you're building your app, so they provide documentation to tell you how to do that and libraries to make it easier. So the docs and libraries for Amplify are written in the more popular mobile and web frameworks today. You see React in bold here because I'm a React guy, and we're going to step through an example, and it will be a React example. Okay, so I want to get into a demo and kind of walk through this. So what we're going to do here is we're going to build a new application, and we're going to use Amplify to build a back-end GraphQL API for us and wire it to our application. So I haven't pre-canned a whole bunch of stuff here. This is pretty bare bones. I do have the Amplify CLI installed. I have configured it. I've created a boilerplate React application using create React app. I've installed the Amplify libraries, and there are two that are applicable to me for React. There's a generic JavaScript library and a React library, so I've installed them. And then I've run Amplify init in my project, which gets me some more Amplify boilerplate, kind of signals to the cloud that I'm going to be using Amplify in this project. So I want to give you a sense of what this looks like. Okay, so this is this readable? Yeah? Okay, so this is that bare bones project. I just wanted to show you some of the boilerplate that I got through installing Amplify. So there's a general Amplify config file here. There's some Amplify folders that have been created through this process. Maybe the most notable folders here, there's one called backend. So as I'm working with Amplify here in my local front-end environment, I'm doing things that will get pushed to the cloud. So you can kind of think of this as a staging environment. So as I say things like I want an API in this application, it'll manage that config in this backend folder. And then when I actually sync with the cloud, it'll capture that configuration in this current cloud backend folder. So this is really the last time I synced. This is what configuration in the cloud looks like. And the significance of having these two folders is that Amplify has some state awareness about what I've done here locally and what's configured for me up in the cloud. So as I work with the CLI to do things, it can ask me different questions, and it'll frame things that it wants me to do based on what my config looks like, what the diff is between local and in the cloud. Okay, so we have our boilerplate project. I've added the Amplify libraries. I've run Amplify in it. Now I want to add an API to this project. So again, I'm in my front-end dev environment, and I'm going to add a back-end. hopefully I'm still connected to the network. So the command to run to add an API to this project is amplify add API. That didn't look like it worked. Oh, there we go. So it's going to start asking me questions so it knows how to configure this API for me. So I'm going to answer that I'm using GraphQL. I can give it a name. I'm just going to take the default. It's going to ask me how I want to authenticate to this API. So I've got two choices here out of the box. I can use an API key, or I can use Amazon Cognito. So Amazon Cognito is AWS's solution for user and identity management. And they actually provide a pretty good integration for an API like this. API key is meant only for development purposes. The keys only last 7 days, and you can only use them for up to a year in the project. So it's good at getting your project started, but you do have to replace it with something. And the Cognito user pool is the most reasonable alternative to using an API key. But I'm going to go with key just to keep things simple. They're going to ask me if I already have a GraphQL schema I want to use to build the API. I'll say no. And then they'll ask me if I want to go through a guided schema creation. And this is kind of Amazon's approach to using AppSync. So whether you use it through Amplify or you use it directly in the AWS console, they tend to try and teach you how to use it through example. So I'm going to follow one of these examples. So I'll take a guided implementation. It's giving me a couple options here. If I had chosen Cognito for the auth choice earlier, it actually gives me a third choice here. But I'm going to take the simple project just to keep us moving. It's going to ask me if I want to edit the schema. I'll say yes. And it has created a schema for me. So this is the world's simplest schema. Notice this looks a little like a GraphQL schema, but it's just the types. Right? So no queries and mutations, no entry points for queries and mutations. But what's going to happen here is it's going to build a backend for me for my API based on how I define this schema file. So hold on to that thought for 1 second. I just want to keep pushing through here. So everything I've done so far is all locally on my laptop here. I haven't pushed anything to the cloud yet. So if we go to AppSync in the cloud, it has no idea that I've asked for an API yet. So I have to execute a command to push this API up to the cloud. I didn't actually mean to hit enter there. This process takes quite a while. This takes about 5 minutes or so to run. Notice the state awareness here, though. It knows that this is a create operation, so it knows that I hadn't previously created this API in the cloud. So it's actually going to ask me another series of questions. So it's going to ask me if I'm sure I want to continue. I'll say yes. It's going to ask me if I want code generated. I'm going to say yes, and we'll see what that means later. I can have code generated for JavaScript, TypeScript, or Flow. If I choose TypeScript or Flow, it'll not only generate code to let me execute queries and mutations, but it'll generate types for me that I can use inside my application. But to keep things simple, I'm just going to go JavaScript. It's going to ask me where I want to put this stuff. I'll take the default. Now it's going to ask me if I want to generate all queries, mutations, and subscriptions. So remember a second ago I said it's going to build an API for me based on this very simple type. And if I answer yes to this question, it's basically going to build a full CRUD representation for this type. So it's going to build a create to do, an update to do, a delete to do. It'll build a get to do, a list to do. It'll build all of the mutations I need to interact with this type. So on the client side, my schema is very basic. On the server side, it's code generating a whole bunch of stuff so that I can operate with this type in my application. Okay, so this is the part that takes too long, and we'll move away from this. So I've got another version of the project here. So this is basically the same project. It's just that command is completed running. I should mention at this point in the cloud, there are a handful of things that have been created for me. So when I did the Amplify init, Amazon has created a CloudFormation stack for me. So for those who are not familiar, CloudFormation is Amazon's infrastructure as code. So as I do stuff, I add an API to my project. What it actually does is builds a CloudFormation stack and then executes that to actually build the resources in Amazon for me. So at this point, I also have an AppSync API set up in the cloud with a full schema, as I talked about. And there are some other goodies too, and we'll get into what those are as we go through this here. Okay, so I just wanted to show you a couple of the things here locally. So when that Amplify push, when the API push completes, it does the code gen that I talked about, and it creates this GraphQL folder. So I haven't created this. This has been automatically created by Amplify. And then it's done what I talked about. So on the client side, it's created representations or wrappers around the mutations and the queries that it's created up in the cloud for me. So I can work with these representations here in my application. I actually make use of these queries, mutations, and subscriptions. It generates those as well. The other thing that's maybe worth noting, I'm not going to open this unless I misclick. It stores the config for the AWS services I've added to my project in this file, this AWS exports file. So in there you'd see my GraphQL endpoint. You'd see how I'm authenticating my API, which is API key, that's what we chose. And you'd see the API key itself. So that's why I'm not opening that. I don't want to have to run home and change this stuff before the recording gets out on the internet. Okay. So let's write some code. So I've created the world's simplest project here. I've created a to-do application. How many people are comfortable with React? Okay, good number. Okay, good. So for those of you who are not, I'll try and keep it fairly high level. But this is a 3-component application. So I have an add to-do component that takes a function that'll let me add a to-do to a list. I've got a list, this is the add to-do function. It's the world's simplest form, has one input and a button.
Make it just a little bigger.
A little bigger, I think I can. Maybe I can't. Oh, wow. How's that?
A little more. A little more.
A little more.
The screen's kind of small. So.
Better? A little better? No, that's okay. So this is my list to do. It's just a simple unordered list. It creates the list though on the basis of a list being passed in, and then I'm just using local state to capture my list of to-dos and to create my add to-do function. I'm just rendering out those 2 components, so you get something that looks really impressive. That's a joke. All right, so you get something that looks like this. Okay, so very straightforward, local state based. So I want to take the exact same application and I want to now take the API that we just built and use it to manage the list of to-dos and to create my add to-do function for me. So you don't have to watch me type anything. I'm a bad typer when people are watching. I've got that on a separate branch here. Okay, so this is, again, the exact same application. The add to-do and list to-do functions have not changed, or components have not changed at all. But I've imported a whole bunch of stuff here. So I've imported the generic Amplify library, which amounts to giving me a GraphQL client, which we'll talk more about in a minute. I've imported the Amplify React library, which has given me access to the connect component, which is going to let me wrap my queries and mutations in a component and expose functions and data through properties, kind of following the render props pattern. And then I've imported the queries and mutations and subscriptions that were code gen for us automatically, along with the config as to where my endpoint is and how I'm authenticating. Right, so all I did here is I wrapped our add to do component using this connect component, and I'm passing in the mutation that's automatically code-gen for us, this create to-do mutation. Similarly, I've wrapped our list of to-dos with our list to-do query that was code-gen for us, along with a subscription that subscribes to on create to-dos so that the list gets updated automatically. And our app, notice the list is different here. So this list is coming down from the cloud. So I can add additional to-dos here. Okay, so that's it. That's all I wanted to show in terms of app. So let's talk a little bit about what's going on here behind the scenes. So we talked about these things. Okay, so I did mention this very quickly as we were going through. So I was in that code example using the Amplify GraphQL client. This is something that Amazon provides. It's a pretty simple, straightforward GraphQL client. It doesn't provide any cache or any offline capabilities, though. So for those features, you need to move up to the AWS AppSync client, which is really a wrapper around the Apollo client. So you get access, you can use it just like you use the Apollo client. You get access to the Apollo cache, but they've also added some offline capabilities to the AppSync client. I think the AppSync client's reason for existing is to simplify authentication in the AWS world, and then also to add some features. The only feature I've seen them add is that offline capability. So I don't know, someone might know more than me. They don't really do a great job of kind of talking about the differences between the Apollo client and the AppSync client, but I use the exact same methods I use when I interact with the Apollo client when I'm using the AppSync client. We talked about auth earlier. I could add auth to my project the exact same way I added an API. There's a pretty good integration there. Okay, but this is the point where someone should be going, how did you build an interactive project here? You created a front end, you created an API, but we didn't write any resolvers, right? So how does the back end, the real back end, get connected to this? And the trick there is directives. So some of you may have noticed in my schema a directive that looked like this, at model. So when you identify a type with the at model directive, you're saying you want AWS to build a DynamoDB table as the back end for that type. So any interaction with this type will resolve to a DynamoDB table. So when I was creating to-dos, they were getting written to DynamoDB. When I was listing them, they were getting read out of DynamoDB. You get the idea. And all that happened automatically. There's also an at connection directive. So if you have types that reference other types, the at connection directive helps DynamoDB figure out where the related table is, where the related data is, so it can stitch together the queries correctly. There's also an at auth directive. So if you're using Cognito, as I talked about, where you've got access to real users, groups, what have you, they have a pretty decent small rule set that you can take advantage of to establish authorization rules around the types that you're using. And then I'll backtrack here. There's also an at searchable directive. If you identify a type with at searchable, AWS will automatically stand up an Elasticsearch cluster for you, and they'll actually build a Lambda function that takes the data you write to DynamoDB and pushes it to Elasticsearch, so that when you query that type, you actually query against Elasticsearch instead of DynamoDB. And then there's also an at versioned directive. This is to maintain versions on the data you're using, right? If you have data that's susceptible to a user trying to update or delete something that another user might have already updated, the at version will make sure all operations happen against the latest version of the data. Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about how AppSync works at this point, right? So we've been focused here on the left-hand side, the blue stuff, right? We wrote a client, we had a schema, we were operating with a GraphQL backend. That really amounted to a GraphQL proxy. And what AppSync really does is it, based on the GraphQL request that comes in, it then figures out I can do something in AWS backend land to satisfy that GraphQL request. So the way it works is you write resolvers that effectively translate that GraphQL request into doing something with what they call a data source. So in our case, our data source with DynamoDB, but you can also use Lambda, Elasticsearch, Aurora, which is Amazon's relational database technologies. Can use HTTP. But the translation happens via something called VTL, or Apache Velocity Template Language. I think this is the point where a lot of people kind of get a little bit of heartburn about working with AppSync, right? Here's another technology, another language I have to learn, something else that could break. But really, I think this translation layer is meant to remain pretty thin, and I'll show you some examples. You get a sense of what it looks like. So let's do that. Let's do that right now. Whoops, I was already there. How's that for size? Bigger? Okay, so these are some APIs I have set up. So this is actually the AppSync API that we were working with in that demo code. So have a look at the schema here. So we created this, and it turned into 115 lines of GraphQL schema, right? So that's what Amplify is bringing to the table. You might like this or you might not like this. The reason it's kind of blown out like this is they've added inputs, right, for the various mutations. They've added some goodies around pagination. So the list function actually supports pagination. They've added filtering to the pagination as well. So they've added some goodies around the stuff that they've automatically generated. This is also the place where I create my resolvers. So let me show you what the resolver for our list to-dos query looks like. So this is editing a resolver. Notice I have a data source here. So this, if we looked at the data sources, you'd see that's our DynamoDB table. And then you can map both the request side, the stuff that comes in from GraphQL goes to the backend, and then you can also map the response back. So whatever comes back from the data source can be mapped to something back to the client. So this is what my entire list resolver looks like. And this includes a limit, a filter, and a next token, right? So some pagination and some filtering. So the business rules are, they're not huge, but this is, it's not a terrible language, but for me it's an unfamiliar language. I had never heard of VTL before doing anything with AppSync. Let me show you a couple other quick things here. So there is a graphical interface built in here as well, right? So if you're doing things, you can do graphical type things. I also want to show you very quickly, I just want to show you the difference between a resolver when Lambda is used as the backend. So this is an API I've created where my data source is a Lambda function as opposed to DynamoDB. And I've created the schema in this case. So this is an API that was built here in AppSync as opposed to having Amplify do it. So you notice this is like 19 lines and doesn't have a full list of queries and mutations. So, I don't build everything that they do. And I wanted to give you a sense of what a resolver might look like if you're using Lambda on the back end. So most of this is boilerplate. Basically, you're just telling it you want to invoke a Lambda function, and then you can pass through the arguments you get In this case, because I'm listing all to-dos, I actually didn't have any arguments. It's maybe not a great example. But the point here is that the translation layer is pretty thin if you're using Lambda, presumably because you're going to build your business rules into your Lambda function instead of trying to implement them here in the translation layer, which is kind of what we saw when Dynamo was the back end of things. And then let me show you one last thing before we get out of here. So we started from the front end. We used Amplify to build our back end. If you start the other way around, if you start on the back end, which I have in this project, and you want to now integrate with the front end, they'll still try and push you towards using Amplify as the tool to glue the back and the front end together. You don't have to use it, right? What AppSync has done is built you an authenticated GraphQL endpoint, so you can integrate that with your project however you want to, but they're going to try and get you to use Amplify as the tool to do that. All right, so let's get back here and we'll wrap things up. So I had a whole list of takeaways that I thought might be meaningful to the group. I kind of picked a handful that resonated with me. So if you're interested in using Amplify, if you're part of a larger team, you may struggle to use it, right? The Amplify CLI wants a pretty significant amount of privileges to create its account, and that account it wants to create is also pretty significantly privileged. So your ops team may not like that. Also, Amplify, all the code that it generates, it doesn't necessarily do a great job of dividing stuff that is developer config from stuff that is project config. You don't want your developer config to get into your repository, right? And one developer checks something in, stomps on another developer, you have this fighting configs. So you've got to be ready with git ignore. For that reason, they don't help you at all with that, with the code that they drop on your machine. Also, I tend to work in a lot of public projects, and I don't want things like my API keys out there, so you got to be ready with git ignore if you're working in public spaces, because you don't want that stuff out there in the world. You saw some of the client-side code gen. First, I thought that was kind of interesting, but then I kind of realized my pattern when I build a React app that's connected to a GraphQL endpoint or a GraphQL backend. It tends to be working with a graphical-like interface. You know, I reason out my query, my mutation, then I cut and paste that into my application. So this idea that someone had provided that for me maybe didn't hold a ton of value. It's kind of interesting, but not overly valuable. If you're using Amplify and AppSync, you've now got config in 2 locations. So you've got to be careful not stomping on that config, right? You don't want a developer working locally changing schema, and then someone's gone to the server, changed the schema, that developer pushes their changes, you end up with conflicts. So just be aware that you probably want to process around where you're going to make your changes. And then the last point, I intentionally started with Amplify here because I was kind of interested in building up the application from the ground. But if you just want a GraphQL API, don't go near Amplify. Just use AppSync on the back end through the console as we did there towards the end. Okay, so last thing. I said some things off the top about how I'm kind of intrigued, or I like serverless as an architectural pattern. Lets me get to production fairly quickly. And what I really mean here is it lets me get to an external environment that I can share with an external user. I don't really mean production ready. But the trade-off is versus control, right? When you're writing resolvers in the language you've used for the last few years, using a backend you've used for the last few years, you've got a lot of control and you know, it feels comfortable. So you have to give some of that up to follow this type of pattern. And the other thing you really have to internalize, if you follow the Amplify pattern that we did creating that app, and you're now using, say, DynamoDB as your back end, you've really got to be prepared to support that if you're going to put real customer data into that environment, right? That's now your back end. So, you know, you probably need processes around backing it up, being able to recover it, all that kind of thing, before you can truly go to production. So for me, this technology has been really valuable around prototyping. I haven't managed to get anything to production that I'm willing to support yet. But that's maybe where its biggest promise is. And the part I really like is if you're using GraphQL this way, and I build my entire client, I can actually swap out the back end without really rewriting my entire client, right? I've got a client that is interacting with a GraphQL back end. If I want to swap out AppSync for a server-generated GraphQL API, that's fairly easy to do. Okay, so that's it. If you're interested in connecting, that's me. I put the slides and code that we went through here up on foolsapps.com. Thank you.